Imagine opening your mailbox and finding a bill for $5,000. No, it's not from your bank, not from the IRS, not even a scam email. It's from your own homeowners association. And the reason for this outrageous demand? Your trees weren't tall enough. That's exactly what happened to Daniel Greene, a quiet homeowner who thought the biggest headache in his yard would be watering the grass during the hot summer months. He kept his lawn trimmed, his hedges neat, and his driveway spotless. His shade trees, 3 neatly planted maples along the front yard, stood strong and healthy. They weren't blocking the street, they weren't dropping limbs onto sidewalks, and they weren't dead or diseased. To Daniel, they were perfect. But to his HOA, those trees were a violation. Their tape measure showed the trees reaching only 6 feet, 10 inches tall. The HOA handbook, buried in endless pages of regulations, stated that all front yard shade trees must reach 8 feet. At first, Daniel thought it was some kind of bad joke. He held the notice in his hands and read it 3 times. The fine wasn't small, it was $5,000. 4 trees that were less than 14 inches shy of an arbitrary rule. Shaking his head, Daniel muttered to his wife, "They wanted me to pay thousands of dollars for something only nature controls. What was I supposed to do, pull the trees like taffy until they stretched?" But the HOA wasn't laughing. Within days, the letter was followed by an official warning. If Daniel didn't pay up or bring his trees into compliance within 30 days, further penalties could follow. To him, it felt absurd. He wasn't a negligent homeowner. He was being punished for not controlling the uncontrollable. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some people thought there had to be a mistake, while others nervously glanced at their own trees, wondering if they were next. Neighbors whispered about the rule, realizing most of them hadn't even noticed it in the handbook. Suddenly, what seemed like a harmless detail in the HOA guidelines turned into a weapon that could cost anyone thousands. Daniel wasn't about to roll over. He called the HOA office, demanding an explanation. The response was cold and robotic. "Sir, the rule is clear. All shade trees must measure 8 feet. Yours do not. The fine stands." Daniel pushed back, pointing out the absurdity. "So let me get this straight. If I do nothing, and my trees keep growing naturally, in 6 months they'll hit the mark. But today, I owe you $5,000. The representative didn't flinch. Correct. That was the breaking point. Daniel realized this wasn't about trees, or appearances, or property values. This was about power and control. And if he gave in, the HOA would feel free to push even harder on everyone else. Fueled by frustration, Daniel decided to fight. He gathered photos of his trees, receipts from the nursery where he purchased them, and even spoke to landscapers who confirmed the trees were healthy and standard for his lot. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, he showed up early, notice in hand, determined to make his case. When the floor opened, Daniel stood. "My trees are healthy, my yard is maintained, and yet I'm being fined $5,000 because they're not tall enough. How is this reasonable?" The room stirred with whispers. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked at the board expectantly. A board member leaned into the mic. "Rules are rules, Mr. Greene. If we let one homeowner slide, others will demand the same." Daniel fired back, his voice steady but sharp. "Slide. These aren't weeds. They're growing. Do you want me to hire a crane and stretch them overnight? This isn't about compliance. It's about control." That line struck a chord. A few people laughed, others clapped quietly, and suddenly Daniel wasn't standing alone. For the first time, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the chairwoman wasn't ready to back down. She banged the gavel and said firmly, "The fine remains. Pay it or face additional penalties." It could have ended there, but something bigger was happening. Daniel's stand inspired others. Neighbors began sharing their own horror stories: fines for mailbox paint that wasn't the exact approved shade, warnings about leaving garage doors open too long, penalties over holiday decorations. People realized they weren't just frustrated individually. They were collectively angry. Soon, Daniel wasn't the only one fighting. The next meeting was packed, this time with dozens of homeowners sitting shoulder to shoulder. One man stood up and said, "If you fine Daniel for his trees, what's next? Fining us for grass that's not green enough." Another woman added, "We pay fees for community upkeep, not for a dictatorship over tree height." The room erupted in applause. For the first time, the HOA board looked cornered, and to make matters worse for them, a local news crew had been tipped off. Cameras rolled as neighbors raised their voices, demanding change. What started as a petty fine had turned into a public scandal. Under pressure, and with the HOA's reputation now being shredded on the evening news, the board quietly backed down. Daniel's fine was dismissed, and the landscaping rules were placed under review. By the following year, the 8-foot tree rule was removed entirely. Daniel's trees, left alone, eventually reached the height requirement on their own. He hadn't spent a dime, but what grew even more was the community's backbone. People realized that sometimes rules aren't about protecting the neighborhood, they're about testing how much control a board can have. And when someone like Daniel refuses to bend, that control crumbles. As Daniel put it later, smiling at the memory, the trees didn't change in that moment, but the neighborhood did, and that was worth a whole lot more than $5,000. When neighbors heard about Daniel's fine, the reaction was explosive. People thought it had to be a clerical error, some absurd paperwork mix-up that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. But the HOA wasn't backing down. Instead, they doubled down. In an official statement to Daniel and, eventually, to the wider community, the board declared, "Consistency in appearance maintains property values. All trees must meet the 8-foot standard without exception." The words were cold, rigid, and final. No room for interpretation, no space for common sense. Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. His trees weren't diseased. They weren't blocking sidewalks. They weren't posing a hazard to anyone. They were strong, green, and carefully maintained, yet somehow, in the eyes of the they had become a $5,000 problem. The absurdity of it made Daniel laugh at first. But the laughter faded quickly. This wasn't a joke. It was real money. Money that could cover months of bills or a family vacation. The thought of handing it over to a board of neighbors armed with tape measures felt insulting. He looked at his wife and shook his head. "They're not protecting property values," he muttered. "They're protecting their own egos." Around the neighborhood, whispers spread like wildfire. "If they can fine him for trees, what will they fine us for next?" One homeowner asked nervously. The fear was real. Some people actually pulled out tape measures, pacing their yards and checking their own trees, terrified they might be the next target. Overnight, homeowners who had once worried about mowing the lawn or keeping weeds under control now lived in fear that their landscaping might not measure up. The atmosphere in the community shifted. Where there had once been a sense of quiet suburban comfort, there was now unease. Neighbors eyed one another suspiciously, wondering who had reported Daniel in the first place. Some suspected it was the compliance officer making rounds with a clipboard, while others whispered about a board member with a personal vendetta. Whatever the case, Daniel had become the center of a storm. Daniel himself wasn't ready to give in. He collected photos of his yard, receipts from the nursery proving his trees were sold as mature shade trees, and even called a local landscaper to measure and verify their health. The expert shook his head in disbelief. "These trees are perfectly fine," he said. "They'll grow another foot in a season. Fining you for this is ridiculous." But when Daniel presented this to the HOA office, the answer didn't change. "Rules are rules," the woman on the phone said flatly. "If we make an exception for you, we'll have to make exceptions for everyone." That phrase infuriated him. Exceptions weren't the point, common sense was, he told his wife. "They're treating us like children who need to be disciplined, not homeowners who actually care about this place." The tension boiled over at the next HOA meeting. Daniel walked in holding the violation notice in one hand and his evidence in the other. The room was full. Neighbors had shown up, curious to see how the showdown would unfold. When the agenda reached yard violations, Daniel stood tall. "My trees are healthy, my yard is neat, and yet I'm being fined $5,000 because they're not tall enough. Can someone explain to me how this is protecting our property values?" The room buzzed with murmurs. Some nodded. Some shook their heads. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, one leaned forward to the microphone. "Mr. Greene, rules are rules. If we let one person slide, the whole system falls apart." Daniel's reply was sharp. "Slide? These aren't weeds I'm ignoring. They're living trees, growing every day. Do you expect me to hire a crane and stretch them overnight? This isn't about compliance. It's about control." Laughter rippled through the audience, followed by clapping. For the first time, Daniel realized he wasn't alone. His fight wasn't just his fight anymore, it was the fight of every neighbor who had been fined, warned, or intimidated by the HOA's endless rulebook. The board chairwoman wasn't impressed. She banged her gavel, her voice stern. "Mr. Greene, this is not a debate. The fine stands. Pay it, or face further penalties." Gasps spread through the room, but Daniel didn't sit down. He stared straight at the board, then turned to the audience. "If they can do this to me, they can do it to you. It's not about my tries, it's about their power." That sentence changed everything. Neighbors who had been silent suddenly found their voices. People began sharing stories of being fined for mailbox colors that were slightly off, for leaving garbage cans out too long, for stringing holiday lights past the approved date. The HOA's pattern was becoming clear, and it wasn't about beautifying the neighborhood. It was about control, intimidation, and revenue. The fight spilled beyond the meeting room. A local news outlet picked up the story, filming Daniel in front of his 2 short trees and interviewing neighbors. Social media caught fire with hashtags like #Treegate and #Hogue. One wild. The absurdity of fining a man $5,000 for trees just inches under the rule became a symbol of everything wrong with overreaching. HOAs backed into a corner and facing growing public outrage. The board finally cracked. The fine against Daniel was dropped, and the landscaping rules were placed under review. Over the following months, more homeowners demanded change, and the infamous 8-foot rule was eventually scrapped altogether. Daniel's trees, they kept growing, untouched. By the end of the summer, they passed the 8-foot mark on their own without costing him a dime. But the real victory wasn't about tree height. It was about a community finding the courage to stand up, together, against rules that made no sense. Later, Daniel joked with his wife. "Funny thing is, the trees didn't change overnight, but the neighborhood sure did." Instead of quietly paying, Daniel went on the offensive. He wasn't going to write a check and pretend it was fair. He wasn't going to roll over and let the HOA drain him for $5,000 over something as absurd as tree height. He gathered everything he could, photos of his yard from every angle, receipts from the nursery proving the trees were sold as mature shade trees, and even expert statements from professional landscapers. Each one confirmed what Daniel already knew: his trees were perfectly healthy, perfectly appropriate, and in every practical sense compliant with community standards. The only problem was a tape measure and an arbitrary rule. When the next HOA board meeting came around, Daniel walked in with a folder under his arm and a fire in his chest. The meeting room was packed, as it usually was when drama stirred in the neighborhood. Residents sat in folding chairs, some sipping coffee, some whispering about the infamous tree find that had become the talk of the block. Daniel spotted a few of his neighbors giving him nods of support as he made his way to the front row. Everyone knew why he was there. The board began their usual routine financial reports, maintenance updates, discussions about pool hours, but nobody was paying much attention. Everyone was waiting for the showdown. When the agenda reached yard violations, Daniel stood up, his voice steady but filled with energy. He laid his folder on the table in front of him and began. My trees are healthy. They're strong, trimmed, and perfectly suited for my property. I have photos here. I have receipts from the nursery. I even consulted professional landscapers who all agreed my trees are compliant in every meaningful sense. Yet here I stand, facing a $5,000 fine because of a measurement that doesn't even affect the safety or beauty of this neighborhood. The room stirred. A few people muttered under their breath, shaking their heads in disbelief. The board, however, remained stone-faced. Their expressions were blank, almost mechanical, as if nothing Daniel said mattered. Finally, one member leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His voice was calm, but his words cut sharp. Mr. Greene, rules are rules. If we make an exception for you, the system falls apart. That phrase, rules are rules, ignited something in Daniel. He raised his voice, not shouting, but projecting with conviction, so every person in the room could hear him. You're not protecting property values. You're holding us hostage over inches of bark and leaves. These are trees. They grow. They change. You can't treat them like fence posts or something. This is nature. This is common sense. And yet here you are, demanding thousands of dollars because my trees are 6 feet, 10 inches instead of 8? The audience reacted immediately. A few clapped, some gasped at his boldness. One woman leaned over to whisper to her husband. Finally, someone's saying it. For the first time, someone had dared to speak the truth out loud, in front of the very people who enforced the rules. Daniel wasn't just defending himself, he was voicing the frustration everyone had carried silently for years. The board shifted uneasily. The member who had spoken pursed his lips, while the chairwoman tapped her gavel lightly against the table as if to regain control. But Daniel wasn't finished. He stepped forward slightly and held up the papers in his hand. If rules are meant to serve the community, then these rules are failing us. They're not protecting anyone. They're punishing us. Do you really believe property values rise because a tree is a few inches taller? Or is this just about proving that you can control us? This time the reaction was louder. Several neighbors clapped openly. A man from the back called out, "He's right." Another woman muttered, "I got fined for leaving my trash can out for one night." It's the same nonsense. The tide in the room was shifting. The authority of the board, once untouchable, was starting to crack under the weight of public opinion. The chairwoman finally spoke, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is not a debate, Mr. Greene. The fine stands. Pay it or face additional penalties." She slammed the gavel once, hoping to silence the crowd. But instead, her firmness only fueled the tension. Daniel turned slowly, facing the room of homeowners behind him. He raised the notice high above his head. "If they can do this to me over trees, they can do it to any of you. This isn't about landscaping. This is about control. And today, I'm telling them no more." The room erupted. Applause, cheers, and even a few shouts of "enough is enough" rang through the air. The board tried to maintain order, but the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, the homeowners realized they weren't powerless. They had a voice, and Daniel had just given it a microphone. What had started as a single ridiculous fine had now grown into a movement. Daniel's defiance had pierced the silence of fear that the HOA had relied on for years. And in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who finally dared to speak out, Daniel knew this fight was bigger than him. His trees had become a symbol not of not compliance, but of resistance to rules that had gone too far. The battle wasn't over, but it had begun. And this time, the homeowners weren't walking into it alone. That meeting lit a fire under the neighborhood in a way no one expected. What started as Daniel's personal fight over a pair of trees suddenly became a spark for years of pent-up frustration. One by one, neighbors began speaking up, and their stories poured out like floodgates breaking. A woman named Mrs. Collins revealed she'd been fined $200 because the shade of beige on her freshly painted mailbox was slightly lighter than approved. Another neighbor admitted he'd been given a formal warning for leaving his garage door open too long while unloading groceries. A young couple confessed they'd received threats of penalties over putting up Christmas lights before the official HOA-approved date. People who had quietly grumbled in their living rooms were now raising their voices in public, and Daniel had unknowingly become the rallying point. Instead of shrinking back under pressure, more and more residents started attending HOA meetings, filling the small conference room until it was standing room only. The once stoic board found themselves facing a wall of angry homeowners demanding answers. One man shouted over the din, "If trees can cost us $5,000, none of us are safe." Heads nodded, fists clenched, and a wave of support for Daniel rolled through the crowd. It was no longer just about his trees, it was about everyone's freedom from what they felt was a reign of petty tyranny. The uproar grew so loud it couldn't stay within the community's walls. Word spread like wildfire, and soon local media picked up the story. Reporters rolled up with cameras, standing on the same sidewalk where Daniel's supposedly offending trees swayed gently in the breeze. Neighbors were interviewed on live television, shaking their heads in disbelief at the idea that inches of tree height could trigger a $5,000 fine. One anchor joked on air, maybe the HOA should issue ladders next time. Clips circulated online, and before long, social media took over. Hashtags like #Treegate and #Hogue1Wild started trending, with thousands of strangers chiming in to mock the absurdity. Memes appeared showing cartoon HOAs measuring trees with rulers, or homeowners sneaking out at night to stretch their branches. What had been a local dispute turned into a viral moment of collective outrage, a kind of modern David versus Goliath story where the little guy was finally standing up against an overbearing system. The shift in power was unmistakable. For years, the HOA had been feared, its letters and threats carried out with unquestioned authority. But now, under the bright lights of media cameras and the relentless glare of public opinion, the board looked less like protectors of property values and more like villains in their own neighborhood drama. Neighbors who once kept quiet out of fear now walked taller. Emboldened by the wave of support for Daniel, they began organizing, forming committees to challenge the board's decisions, circulating petitions, and openly calling for reform. What the board had dismissed as a simple rules situation had snowballed into a full-blown movement for change. Daniel's trees, standing quietly at the edge of his lawn, had become symbols of defiance, and every homeowner who glanced at them was reminded that they weren't powerless. They were a community, and together, they could push back against the heavy hand of the HOA. Under the relentless glare of public pressure, the HOA finally cracked. What began as rigid, stone-faced insistence that rules are rules melted away when the cameras showed up, when hashtags exploded, and when the neighborhood united against them. Quietly, without any grand announcement or apology, the board dismissed Daniel's $5,000 fine. The official letter arrived in his mailbox weeks later, just as cold and bureaucratic as the original notice. But this time it contained only a single line: "Fine, dismissed pending review." For Daniel, it was both a relief and a vindication. He hadn't written a check, hadn't caved to intimidation, and yet he had one. But he wasn't satisfied with just his personal victory. He knew that if the rule stayed in place, the HOA could simply target the next unlucky homeowner. So he made it his mission to ensure no one else would go through the same ordeal. Daniel began showing up at every meeting, not as a victim, but as a voice of reform. He brought neighbors with him, gathering signatures for petitions, drafting proposals, and using the momentum of the media spotlight to his advantage. What had once been a dry, sleepy HOA meeting filled with yawns and apathy had now become the center stage of a small but powerful rebellion. Neighbors who had never spoken out before stood up and shared their frustrations, lending weight to Daniel's fight. Together, they demanded a permanent change to the landscaping requirements. They argued that property values were not protected by measuring tape, but by creating a livable, welcoming neighborhood free from the suffocating grip of arbitrary fines. The pressure worked. By the next year, the 8-foot tree requirement once touted as essential for community uniformity was gone, struck from the handbook with a unanimous vote that the board could no longer resist. And here's the twist that made the whole ordeal even more absurd. Those same trees, the very ones deemed too short to exist in Daniel's yard, grew naturally to 8 feet by the end of that summer. He hadn't spent a dime. He hadn't hired landscapers to bend the rules or paid any special fees. He simply let nature take its course. The trees, left in peace, did what trees have always done: they grew. Daniel would walk past them with a grin, often shaking his head at the irony. The HOA had demanded thousands of dollars to fix a problem that fixed itself for free. To him, the sight of those now tall trees wasn't just about shade or beauty, it was about principle, proof that common sense could still prevail against bureaucracy gone wild. Looking back on the chaos, Daniel often joked about the surreal nature of it all. With a grin, he'd tell reporters and neighbors they wanted my money, but instead they gave me a platform. All I had to do was stand tall, something my trees were already planning to do anyway. His words struck a chord, not just in his community but across the internet. People who had never even heard of his HOA before now remembered his fight as a symbol of standing up against pettiness and overreach. The story was shared in blogs, local news segments, and social media posts for months afterward. Parents told it to their kids as a parable about fairness. Neighbors repeated it at block parties and barbecues. It became more than just a headline, it became a neighborhood legend. Even years later, new homeowners would hear whispers about the time a man and his two short trees toppled the HOA. They would laugh, shake their heads, and marvel at the ridiculousness of it all. But for those who had lived through it, the lesson was crystal clear. Sometimes, the smallest battles, the inches of a tree trunk, the shade of a mailbox, the timing of Christmas lights can reveal the biggest truths about power and resistance. Daniel's fight wasn't just about trees. It was about showing that communities work best when they're built on cooperation, not control, on respect, not punishment. And in the end, all it took was a man, his determination, and a couple of trees that grew just fine without anyone's permission.